Hello, I'd like to thank you all for inviting me to speak today. Kate Starbird from the University of Washington, and I'm going to talk about online misinformation and disinformation in the context of COVID-19 and election 2020. Over the last over the last few months, we've been, they feel like years. Over the past few months, we've been exposed to a lot of misinformation. We've seen Facebook posts warning of an imminent lockdown and urging us all to rush to the grocery store as soon as we could, which was probably not the best idea in the midst of an emerging pandemic. We've seen social media posts and email chains talking about home remedies that were supposed to help us keep safe from COVID. And as time passed, we began to see conspiracy theories take root. For example, about what causes the virus and its origins. Eventually, we saw this: a slick video making false and dangerous claims about the virus being planned and sowing distrust in both masks and the eventual vaccines. This video, originally posted on YouTube, spread through Facebook, Twitter, and several other websites. It eventually received more than 8 million views on YouTube. It was taken viral by networks of anti-vaccine activists, conspiracy theorists, and hyper-partisan media outlets, which it was a hint towards some of the intersections that we continue to see play out, spreading misinformation, disinformation today. Now, rumors, misinformation, disinformation are part of the online discourse during crisis events, but misinformation didn't just start with the internet. We, as humans, have always been vulnerable to spreading rumors and misinformation during crisis events. So why is this? So crisis events are characterized first and foremost by uncertainty. An event has happened and we often don't know its impacts at the moment, how many people have been injured, what kind of damage has been done. Along with that uncertainty, we feel anxiety as humans. How do we react to this disaster? How do we take care of ourselves? How do we protect our families and our communities? And so we don't like this feeling of anxiety, and we don't like this uncertainty. And so we try to solve these, we try to resolve them. And when we do that by coming together in this process that scientists like to call collective sense making, where we try to share information with each other and come up with explanations, theories for what might be happening to try to reduce our uncertainty and our anxiety. And unfortunately, this collective sense-making process can go awry. One of its byproducts are rumors, and rumors can turn out to be true, but often rumors turn out to be false. And so this collective sense-making process can accidentally create misinformation. This sense-making process can also be exploited. So people can target these processes to try to manipulate them for their own objectives. And historically, collective sense-making was happening in physical spaces, but now it's happening online, and these exploiters can target these processes from anywhere in the world. So COVID-19 turns out to be a perfect storm for the spread of misinformation. We have this persistent uncertainty, scientific uncertainty, where the science around COVID-19 was incomplete and still changing day to day. We also have both prolonged and acute impacts where the lives of people all around the world are profoundly disrupted for months and months and months. On top of that, we already have this sort of distrust in authorities and displaced gatekeepers, where historically we all kind of came together around certain news sources, and there was problems with that. But now we've got all this access to different information in different places, which is great, except it's often hard to figure out whom we can and should trust. In addition, we have this heavily politicized information space, which I would argue is wired for disinformation. Election 2020 was, actually it is, a crisis as well. We're seeing unprecedented and dynamic impacts from COVID-19, uncertainty due to delays in counting mail-in votes, which is a reaction in some cases to trying to adapt to COVID-19. Political influencers sowing distrust in the results. It started before the election and continues to this day. And again, this heavily politicized and polarized information space. Now, I want to talk a little bit right now about the difference between misinformation and disinformation, because it's really important for understanding what's sort of happening in our information spaces right now. So misinformation is information that's false, but not necessarily intentionally false, like those rumors that turn out not to be true. Disinformation, on the other hand, is false or misleading information that's purposefully seeded and/or spread for a specific objective, for instance, a financial or a political objective. Disinformation is often built around a true or plausible core, so something that people already tend to maybe believe, and then kind of wrapped up in a wrapper that starts to mislead them for a particular purpose. And it functions often not as a single piece of content, but a set of information actions or a campaign. I would argue, and I think a lot of us in the disinformation space would argue, that pervasive disinformation erodes the foundations of democratic societies. It diminishes our trust in information, in government, in the democratic processes themselves, and in each other. Now, when we look back to disinformation 2016, it was a big story, but it was a very different story. It was just we were seeing it as something that was foreign, perpetrated by thousands of inauthentic accounts, Russian trolls at the time, and it was coordinated by an agency that was trying to manipulate us from the outside. If we look at disinformation in 2020 in the US election, very different story. We're seeing something that's domestic, largely coming from inside the US. Foreign governments were trying to impact things, but they don't seem to have played a major role. Instead, we saw mostly authentic accounts from blue check or verified individuals, along with some more anonymous members of the connected crowd, working together. But this disinformation campaign wasn't entirely coordinated, but instead it was cultivated, even organic in places, with everyday people creating and spreading disinformation about the election. For the remainder of this talk, I'm going to draw on insights we learned through the Election Integrity Partnership. The EIT was a collaboration between 4 organizations: Stanford's Internet Observatory, Graphica, the DFR Lab, and our team at the University of Washington. Across the 4 organizations, we had more than 120 researchers, as well as partners in government, at the social media platforms, and in civil society. And we worked from August into December, conducting rapid analysis of information threats to election integrity. Now, that encompassed several different types of information threats, but I'm going to focus here on false and misleading information that function to sow doubt in the election results. In other words, what became the election fraud disinformation campaign. Bankler and colleagues gave this effort that term, disinformation campaign, several weeks prior to the election. And indeed, it began long before November 3. Here's a tweet from President Trump's official Twitter account from back in June 2020, stating that the election would be rigged. And here's an example of how the online crowd produced evidence to support that rigged claim. It's a shocking tweet featuring this image of thousands of ballots in a dumpster in California. The subtext here is that the mail-in voting process is fraudulent. The author, a journalist on the far right, tweets out this image and says, "Big if true," except it wasn't true. The ballots were from 2018, they were being recycled. This had nothing to do with the 2020 election. But that didn't stop this narrative from going viral. It was tweeted and retweeted more than 25,000 times. Here's a graph showing how it spread. On this graph, time runs left to right. The number of tweets sharing this narrative is plotted on the y-axis, and each tweet is plotted at the time it was shared as a shape on the graph, with tweets that are bigger representing the accounts of people with larger audiences. And so here's the original tweet in the bottom left of the graph. And then here's how it moved through other influential social media accounts, including right-wing media outlets, and eventually it was retweeted by Donald Trump Jr. in what would become a common pattern across these narratives. Now, I want to note that we did see in our analysis some disinformation spreading on the political left, in particular about claims that the US Postal Service was purposefully taking mailboxes out of commission to suppress mail-in votes. But the disinformation on the left was dwarfed by what we saw on the political right. Leading up to the election, we saw networks of politically motivated information activists, social media influencers, and hyperpartisan media outlets repeatedly picking up evidence of voting concerns, framing that evidence in misleading ways, and strategically amplifying that content to support meta-narratives that undermine trust in the election. This disinformation campaign continued into the election and beyond, and it was surprisingly transparent for people that were paying attention. About a week before the election, we put out a report about what to expect on election day and beyond. And it included this slide. We were going through different kinds of periods. We talked about what was going to happen on election day, what would happen in the uncertainty filled in the election night, and maybe the next few days as the votes were counted, and what might happen with shifts from red to blue or blue to red if those happen. And we kind of highlighted some of the things that we expected, including that photos and stories of mistreated ballots and malfunctioning machines would be shared on election day, that we would see out of context images and videos that were mixing real content and things from the past. We would see minor discrepancies overemphasized online and in the media. We also figured out that, we also thought we would see that this information that was shared on election day would be assembled to fit these false narratives of voter fraud. And that there would be sort of both bad statistics used to support these, as well as premature declarations of victory that would be used to sow doubt and question shifts in vote tallies, as well as legal complaints and affidavits filed to sort of support these cases in different ways. Now, we didn't expect that to be going on through December and into January, but we were expecting to see that in the weeks following the election. What we ended up experiencing afterwards were many of these narratives, not exactly what we were expecting, but many similar kinds of narratives, false and misleading claims that observers were denied access, that in some ways were covering for some kind of cheating, false claims about people moving ballots in suitcases, false claims about large numbers of dead people voting, claims that voting machines or software systems switched votes to candidate Biden, and so many instances of torturing statistics to claim evidence of massive voter fraud. If we look closely at one prominent narrative where issues with Sharpie pens grew into a theory that specifically Trump voters had been disenfranchised by being forced to use Sharpies, we actually can use this case to see kind of how some of these narratives developed. Now, initially the tone of many of these Sharpie-related tweets was one of concern, worries on election morning that votes wouldn't count, directives to bring your own pen. But soon that concern turned to suspicion. And eventually the discourse shifted to explicit accusation that this was an intentional effort to disenfranchise specifically Trump voters. And though the first claims about Sharpies being a problem occurred in Chicago, eventually the accusations converged around Arizona for a very strategic reason. So let's look at how this narrative spread. We ended up collecting more than 700,000 tweets related to voting in the election that also contained the word Sharpie. And these narratives ended up feeding into the Stop the Steal movement that we're still experiencing today. But let's just focus on how the narrative took off late on election night. It was actually early election morning, about 2 a.m. Eastern time on November 4th. The surge in complaints about Sharpies corresponds very closely to when Fox News calls Arizona for candidate Biden. And this was a big shift in what the expectations would have been for the Trump campaign on whether or not they would win. And again, early tweets about Sharpies were distributed around the country, but eventually the Sharpiegate narrative begins to focus exclusively on Arizona. And it happens at right this time. So let's see what's going on. We had some early initial reports of Sharpies bleeding through on election day. So they're bleeding through the ballots. It turned out the ballots were designed for that. And so the vote machines would still count the ballots if the Sharpies bled through, but that it might look like to someone experiencing it that there might be something wrong with their ballot. So we saw these initial reports on election day. But then we see what happens at the time of the surge is that a series of pro-Trump accounts and right-wing influencers, including conservative activist Charlie Kirk, and then later President Trump's 2 adult sons, amplify this narrative, and then it shoots off into the stratosphere, right? So they become the core amplifiers in how this narrative becomes part of the larger discourse. So I want to step back here and think about what's going on with these dynamics. So disinformation, as we're thinking about it, as we're seeing in our analyses, is participatory. President Trump and his campaign didn't just prime his audience to be receptive of false narratives of voter fraud. They inspired them to produce these narratives themselves and then echoed those false claims back to them. It's a very powerful experience of propaganda or disinformation. It's both top down and bottom up. So the elite set the agenda, they seeded these narratives, they put them out there in the world, but then the audiences created the evidence to fit the narratives. They help find the fittest of the narratives and conspiracy theories. And then the elites echoed those back to the audiences, rewarding and motivating them to continue to create this. So this is two-way disinformation. It's participatory disinformation. In addition to these participatory dynamics, and as both a result and a driver of them, the networks are wired for disinformation. We have dense networks of mutually following accounts that repeatedly activate to spread false narratives. This is a table we created of repeat offenders in the Twitter sphere. The accounts that were repeatedly influential or highly retweeted, helping false narratives about the election go viral, feeding into this false narrative of election fraud. Among the repeat offenders, we have President Trump and his two adult sons. And President Trump's account is the most highly retweeted account in the spread of false narratives of voter fraud in our data. 21 distinct narratives, nearly 2 million retweets in our collections. We also have accounts of hyperpartisan news outlets and pundits here in orange. In green, we have conservative political activists, for instance, from Turning Point USA and Judicial Watch. In purple, other GOP affiliated accounts, including former candidates, current and former members of the Trump administration, and GOP operatives. And in yellow, a couple of high profile accounts from within the QAnon movement. Now, online disinformation is participatory, and the networks are wired for disinformation. What we saw on January 6th was a physical, violent manifestation of the same dynamic, an insurrection attempt motivated by the same disinformation campaign described here in this work, with symbols and memes of internet culture come alive in the physical world. Now, so what do we do now? Now, the platforms have begun to take action, suspending some of the accounts responsible for this disinformation campaign, including President Trump's Twitter account, and a whole section of QAnon influencers and MAGA tweeters. This is a good first step, but too late to address the damage that's already been done. The massive amounts of people who are now living in an alternative reality shaped by these disinformation campaigns. I have hopes that the platforms will continue to evolve their policies to better address these issues. And I want to point out that we pick on Twitter a lot, but that's only because they make their data public and publicly available for research. Other platforms are seeing these same problems, and in many cases, it's just harder for us to figure out what's going on there. So I feel like we've seen Twitter take some good actions, and we're hoping that other platforms can do this as well. I really want to recommend that they develop clear and transparent policies that enable rapid and decisive action, rather than waiting for dominoes to fall and being reactive as they were in many cases on January 6th. And so they have a long way to go, but this is a lot of responsibility, perhaps too much responsibility to place solely in the hands of these platforms. And we need to figure out other kinds of ideas for governance. This is a complex problem, a multidimensional problem, and we're not going to solve it with a new feature on Facebook, a few bans of problematic accounts, or any other single solution. We're going to need to work together across academia, industry, government, and civil society to start addressing this problem together, to help us become more resistant as a society to disinformation, and to start building back the trust we need to be a healthy democratic society. I want to thank you all very much, and I really want to thank all of the amazing students, postdoctoral fellows, and collaborators that we've had on this project. And I absolutely wouldn't be standing here today with anything to say without just a massive team effort to make sense of this election-related data and to attempt to make an impact on this against this disinformation campaign. So thank you all very much.